When you are debugging, you need to see the information stored in variables and other objects in your code. Data tips and data visualizers are provided by Visual Studio to show you this information. For this demonstration, I'm using the solution Data Tips and Data Visualizers. I will start in Data Tips and Data Visualizers project. Make that my start project. And then we'll go look at the code inside this main window.xaml. I'll start by looking at the code inside this button. I'll debug my application and then click on this Data Tips button. A data tip is just a tooltip that floats over top of the variable when you hover your mouse over it. I'm going to press F11 to step through several lines of code, and then I'll hover my mouse over each one of these variables to see the current value. When you load it with a more complex type, like this birth date, you can hover your mouse over the item, and then when you hover over this plus symbol, or click the plus symbol, you can get details about that type. This also works with items like an array. Currently, I have an array with 15 items. If I hover over this plus symbol, I can see the items in the list. As I step through this for loop by pressing F11, I'm adding a current date timestamp to that array. Now when I hover over this for the data tip, you'll notice that the first two items have a new timestamp. I can also drill down into the individual items by hovering over the plus symbol. I want to move down to this section of the code now. So here's a tool you can use in Visual Studio. Right-click on this line and choose Run to Cursor. This means I don't have to keep pressing the F11 key. Now I'm ready to run line 49. I'll press F11 and then hover over List. A couple more things you can do with data tips. One of the things you can do is right-click on the data tip and do things like copy the value. And I'll open up Notepad and paste in the value. Another thing you can do is right-click and choose Add Watch. I'll talk more about watch windows later, but you can see there's a watch down here in this section. Another interesting thing you can do is pin the data tip. Click here to pin the data tip. Now this data tip can be moved anywhere inside your code window, and it's monitoring the list. So as I press F11 and step through the list, you'll see I now have 4 items in here, and I can inspect the list with this pinned data tip. Let me stop debugging. Press F5 to start debugging again. Move down here, and you see that my data tip is still there. I'll choose Run to Cursor. And that data tip will stay there until you click on the X button. If you want to look at data with a more complex structure, then you can use a visualizer. I have 4 demonstrations for visualizers here. A visualizer essentially is a floating window that knows how to load a complex piece of data, for example, an XML file. There are text, HTML, and XML visualizers, all of which work on string objects. There is a WPF tree visualizer for displaying the properties of a WPF object tree, and the dataset visualizer, which works for datasets, data view, and data table objects. I'll show you a few of these. Click on this first button, step through my code by pressing F11. I'm going to load an XML file with this line of code here. When I hover over this, the data tip is showing me the XML file, but it's showing me on a single line, and it's not very viewable this way. I can't really scroll to the end of this list. I click on this magnifying glass. I can then choose a different visualizer, the XML visualizer. Now you see I get a floating window with an XML visualizer. Next, I'll show you the text visualizer. Here I'm loading the contents of a TXT file. Again, when I hover over it, it's not very readable, so I'll click on the magnifying glass and choose the text visualizer. Now I can read the text file without having to open it in Notepad. I'll press F5 to continue. Next, we'll choose the HTML visualizer. Same steps, load the HTML page. Click on HTML visualizer. And here you can see my bold header and my hyperlinks are now working. For my last demonstration, the WPF visualizer, I'm going to stop running this application and make this Explore CA project my startup. Now I've run the application by pressing F5. I'm going to click on the Entry button, step down here to this line of code by pressing F11. Now when I get my data tip, I'll choose the magnifying glass and the WPF tree visualizer. I'll maximize this window. The way this works is it shows the current item in my visual tree, this Details button. Then in the bottom half of the screen, it's showing the rendering of that button. And then over on the right side of the screen are all the properties for that button. For instance, here's the bitmap effect or the content property. Let's see what happens as I drill through these items in the visual tree. This is what the entire UI looks like. Now I'm going to open this stack panel and click on each one of these individual text blocks. So I can drill down and see each text block, look at it here, see how it relates to the rest of the object in the runtime visual tree, and read all the information in the property window. So as you've seen, visualizers and data tooltips give you an enormous amount of information while you're debugging your application.